So, Matt, we're here in Gloucester, Massachusetts to talk about the Land-Based Aquaculture Report. Tell me, what is the Land-Based Aquaculture Report?
The report is a global database of projects in the world that either operating or in design phase that use recirculating technology to grow fish or shellfish on land. That is it in its essence.
Why do they grow shellfish and fish on land? Don't they do that in the ocean?
Well, most fish production systems, farming aquaculture systems, have the initial phase of production on land when you're talking about the larvae or the fingerlings or the very small fish start in hatcheries.
Uh-huh.
And hatcheries are often tanks. The fish are at a certain temperature. They get to a certain size, and then they go out to sea.
Right.
And this has been going on since the Norwegians really mastered salmon farming. And also something as well that not a lot of people know, hatcheries also support wild fish. So, for example, if you go up to Alaska, you'll find that there are government-run hatcheries to improve the salmon runs in Alaska.
Oh, sure. I've seen that before where the truck arrives and they actually dump all these little tiny fish into the stream.
That's right.
Yeah, right.
And even as well with sports fisheries,
right,
so
right.
drum in the Atlantic.
Right.
And so there's that as well.
So there's a history of growing the tiny fish on land, but then why are they growing them to full size on land now instead of doing it in the ocean?
There are certain species where there is a shortage of fish. So salmon's become incredibly popular all around the world. Everybody's eating it. People in Vietnam eat salmon. And it's just become this thing which is super popular. And salmon can only be grown in very specific areas. You have they can only be grown in areas where the ocean temperature gets up to about 15 Celsius, but at all times of year. And then you've also got to be in protected fjords and bays. And basically what that means is that you can only farm salmon in parts of Canada, Iceland, Norway, a little bit of Northern Europe around UK, Faroe Islands. Chile is the one that the Norwegians found, and they discovered a whole bunch of fjords. So Chile is the largest seller of salmon to this country, and it's the second largest worldwide. Then you've got areas that like a tiny bit of Russia. So Russia's you've got like this little bit at the north, a neck at the northwest near, basically near the Norwegian border, and then potentially now the Far East with global warming. But generally, there's almost very, very few places where you can grow it. So supply is just not keeping up with demand.
I see.
And as the industry's been growing larger fish at the hatchery phase, so they're getting more and more proficient at this, we've got to a point where there are a few early ventures to take the full production cycle on land. Basically.
Oh, okay. And so you're saying the full production cycle is relatively nascent in the industry, whereas the initial stages of growing the fish is well established.
Yeah. It's very nascent. So really, there's only been the full cycle production for about the last 10 to 15 years.
Okay.
The first ever commercial scale farm that can technically produce 10,000 tons a year is in Miami. In Atlantic, it's called Atlantic Sapphire. It's a company that was built. It started to produce at the beginning of COVID in 2020. There was huge expectation about this one company. It reached $1 billion market valuation on a stock exchange without ever producing any fish, and that's been the front runner. And it's had various technical setbacks, and so we're sort of still at this very early initial phase of viability.
So as an outsider to the industry, if you asked me to guess, where would you put a land-based farm to grow fish? I would say Iceland or Norway or somewhere cold. Why would they put it in Miami?
So Miami had the certain characteristics that made sense. One is that they have this huge aquifer, the Floridian aquifer, that has water that's available at certain temperatures underground. And some of the temperatures are quite cool. That it's also brackish water, so can't be used for municipal water, but it's perfect for salmon. So they found a really good spot where they thought the water resource is highly adequate. And also they found that the permitting process in Florida was quite straightforward. We've seen other projects where often Norwegian-backed ventures have come to the States and Canada, and they've tried to do it in Maine, for example, and those projects haven't managed to go through the permitting process.
So you're explaining that the full cycle production is nascent, and you've described a project that has struggled in Miami. What do you see as the future for this? Does this have legs?
Basically, the conventional salmon industry is using this technology to grow larger fish on land before they put it out to sea. So this is a strange industry. It's not like a brand new industry like insect farming. This is an industry where the companies that are doing regular net pen production are building the very same systems to grow much larger fish before they go out to sea, and they kind of get finished off at sea. That the Norwegians are now calling this the hybridization of the industry. And Norway is producing vast amounts of these fish now, larger, mid-sized fish in tanks, and then they go out to sea. And the Norwegians in the last 2 or 3 years, our report records the amount of new capacity being built, and it's huge. It's like 2 times Atlantic Sapphire every single year that they're commissioning to basically turn their industry into a hybrid industry. But also we see a lot of these ventures to do it completely on land. The dynamic there, or the theory, is that you put one of these facilities right next to where consumers are, let's say New York City or Tokyo. And there is actually one near Tokyo that's just being commissioned right now. So
you've talked a lot about Norwegians, and when I think Norway, I think salmon. Is this really a technology that's best suited to salmon, or is it relevant in other species as well?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because actually the technology, Atlantic salmon is a really difficult fish to grow on land. It's even difficult to grow it in the sea. It's super delicate. It really doesn't like any type of temperature deviation, and it takes ages to grow. So if you think of most terrestrial, protein animals like chicken, that may be months, salmon takes 3 years. So if you imagine the amount of risk in taking an animal from 0 months to 36 months, there's a lot of risk in that. And that's been the main downfall at the moment of the RAS, the recirculating technology, is that at any point in the production cycle, you can have something go wrong. You can run out of oxygen. You can have a hydrogen sulfide outbreak within hours, where it's just the biology is not quite right, and it's a super risky process.
I'm going to ask you about recirculating. So I used to live in Taiwan 30 years ago, and I had a huge fish tank, probably 5-6 feet long, and I raised a thing called a dragonfish.
Wow.
And it starts little like this, and you feed it goldfish, and every day it eats goldfish, and it ended up massive. It's big goldfish. And one day we had to get rid of the fish tank, and we froze this fish. But when we thought about consuming this fish, I mean, it was in what I would describe as a recirculating system of a sort, but I just was not inclined to eat it. So tell me about recirculating.
But was the water going back into the tank, or was it flowing through?
Well, yeah, actually, probably define what is recirculating. What is the technology, and why? How does it keep it all clean?
Yeah, so you have something on a recirculating system called a biofilter. So if you imagine. We go. I'm going to try and say this in a way that's not gross.
Right.
We're in a swimming pool, right?
Right.
And if you go in with
There's
a
children.
4-year-old,
There's
or
a bunch of
5-year-old,
children. Yeah, we get it.
They
Do the
might
math.
pee in the pool.
Right.
But that water will just go out. It's flow through. With the fish, we're talking about hatcheries. Traditionally, were flow through. Now they're in many parts of the world where there isn't access to abundant water. It's recirculating. So the water goes in. First of all, it goes through what we call a drum filter that takes out the larger particles. Then it goes through a biofilter. The biofilter really addresses the water chemistry. Then they oxygenate the water again, and it goes back into the system. So it goes through a bunch of filtration processes, and the water comes in and is replenished.
Is it fresh water, or is it brackish, or?
Both. So it depends what species you're talking about. Some are freshwater systems, and some of these systems now are brackish. When we talk about the salmon, there's both cycles. So these systems mimic what happens in nature. So year one is fresh water,
I see.
and then brackish water is added, and then you go to salt water.
Would you drink the recirculated fresh water?
Yes, I know that it's good enough.
Yeah.
I've been around it enough now to know that I've seen enough recirc systems. I've been in, oh my goodness, like 20, 30 facilities around the world. I know exactly what happens in that process.
So back to the Norwegians, why are they growing fish larger and larger on land? Like, I would have thought it would be cheaper to grow them in the ocean. Or if it's not, why aren't they just growing them to completion on land? Why do they want to do this hybrid system?
So to go back to one of the things we discussed at the beginning, the finite resource here, the bottleneck, are the sea pen licenses. So there aren't that many of them. That's the main thing. There's two dynamics going on at the moment. There are more challenges at sea. There's more biological challenges. There's more sea lice. And most scientists believe this is a product of climate change. There's micro jellyfish more recently, and the quality of Norwegian fish, of Norwegian salmon's been going down because of the challenges in the sea. And the principal tool that these guys have to solve this problem is actually by shortening the sea pen cycle. So they don't have a magic bullet to kind of solve sea lice, but the thing they can do is get them out of the water for more time, especially if they're not in the water for 2 summers. Because if they're in for 2 summers, the fish gets weakened in the first summer, and then a lot of them die just before they're at the ideal weight in the second summer.
I see.
So that's the one benefit. The other big benefit for the Norwegians is if they speed up the cycles. So let's say I grow the fish to a kilo of weight or 800 grams, and I've shortened my sea pen cycle to 1 year. That means that I can then go and use that pen again in a year's time for a new batch. So over time, I'm going to produce more.
You use the term net pen, which I didn't know, but I can understand what it means. About 15 years ago, I was in Tasmania, and it's a beautiful place in the, it's an island, as you know. And we were on a boat cruise, and we saw what must be called a net pen fishery of some sort.
Yeah,
so what would they be growing down there?
Yeah, on Tasmania. There's 3 salmon farming companies.
Oh.
Yeah, there's one of them. They were all Australian owned. Now I think one of them is owned by a Canadian company called Cook.
Right.
You know Cook.
Sure.
Yeah, another one is owned by JBS from Brazil, huge meat packing company.
Okay.
And I think that one of them, and I might be wrong, is still family owned.
So is it that?
But, and they're all salmon. They're Atlantic salmon.
Oh, it is salmon. I didn't know. Oh, they're Atlantic salmon. Okay.
Yeah. So basically, Tasmania is of all of the salmon farming areas, Tasmania is the one that's really on the cusp of it's only just cold enough for Atlantics. And those guys have been quite innovative in improving the genetics of the salmon to cope with warmer conditions. And secondly, by going slightly more offshore. So that's a tricky thing.
So parts of New Zealand are more south than Tasmania. Can you grow Atlantic salmon in the ocean in New Zealand?
But the curious thing is, and I think this is by law, that you can only grow king salmon in New Zealand and no other types. So there's one company. I think there's maybe 2 or 3, but they actually produce king salmon. There's one. In actual fact, there's a company called New Zealand King Salmon that produces the most expensive salmon anywhere in the world. And it's actually farmed, and it's a top quality fish. That company actually is trying to go offshore. It's got an offshore project.
So you've just produced your latest edition of the Land-Based Aquaculture Report. What's new in the report?
I talked about that company that reached a valuation of $1 billion.
Yeah.
There was a period of time at the beginning of COVID or 2019 when there was this huge expectation about this industry that it was going to revolutionize salmon farming. And we were going to get all of these crazy salmon farms turning up in every single city of the world. Mm-hmm. With the failures of some of the early projects, and to be fair to Atlantic Sapphire, every industry has an innovator. Yeah. They've actually done quite well, and they're still in business. Mm-hmm. And they're producing salmon right now. So it's not like these guys have failed.
Right.
but there is definitely more dampened expectations. What's happening now is really similar to one of those S curves that you see in innovation, where you have the feverish kind of, the peak of inflated expectations, and then you go through the trough of delusionment. We've sort of had that period.
Sure.
And now we're on this kind of period where we actually see some real success stories.
Yeah.
I've just been to Denmark and I've seen a company called Skagen Salmon. And Skagen Salmon are fully stocked. They are fully recirculating, or 95%. These guys are doing great. Their feed rates are up at almost the maximum levels. And so we're starting to see some companies that can actually do this technology. We're also starting to see some companies that are using another type of hybrid, which is producing it entirely on land, but not fully recirculating. So only partially recirculating. And you circumvent some problems. And those guys are doing super well as well.
So if it's not recirculating, what's the other technology called?
It's called hybrid flow through in the industry. There's one particular company that's called Salmon Evolution that I also visited recently. It's basically grown an entire, at least 2 or 3 batches very successfully. It doesn't need the biofilter, which is this tricky component of the system. And they're doing super well, and they're raising money. They're just about profitable. And
so, what are the barriers to having more flow through systems?
I think one of the big issues is that investors want to see more success stories. First of all, they'd like to see some more steady state production, but more importantly, I think that the capex, while the opex of these projects is quite competitive, because you're taking, you don't have to fly in the salmon from the Faroes. Right. So you've got this built-in advantage. But at the same time, the capex to build these projects is very large. Yeah. So, for example, here there's a project called Aqua Bounty that's in Pioneer, Ohio. Sure. That's a project that takes $450 million to put 10,000 tons a year of salmon onto the market. And the capex is quite high. And so really, I think that if you compare the capex per ton of the different production systems, for sure, you need more salmon. So, even if you are producing at a higher cost, you're still going to make money. So there is, demand for some of these things. But the capex is very high. And I think that anybody who manages to innovate to get that capex down, there's a lot of concrete that you need. A lot of building and steel and cement and which is all money, especially today.